Hello, and welcome back to Bossing Poetry Comparison with Mr. F. It's been a while, so we're going to make this a nice quick one, doing a poetry comparison question, looking at checking out my history, which I don't think has ever come up, so it could come up this year, and thinking about ways we could compare that. So let's have a look. Here's a question. Let me just get something that I can use to indicate things with. Yeah. Here's the question. Compare how poets present the abuse of power in Checking Out Me History and One Other Poem. Make sure you do One Other Poem because they really want an A-B comparison. Okay, so what are the key words in that question? Compare how poets present, that means language, structure, form, the abuse of power in Checking Out Me History and One Other Poem. Okay, well, Checking Out My History is very loose, freestyle, representative of Agard and his experiences and his wish to kind of reclaim his heritage from the colonial control of various empires, the French, the British, etc. in Guyana, in South America. So it has this very loose, free style without punctuation. So for me, a good comparative one there would be Ozymandias, which is it appears quite rigid and strict because it follows sonnet form. So immediately you've got something that you can talk about. One is using that strict sonnet form, even though it's a mix of two forms, Elizabethan, Petrarchan, and this loose, free-flowing, free-form, free verse of Agard. When we're comparing, these are the things we should be thinking about. There are 6 marks for context, and we get marks for language, structure, and form. Whatever we're talking about, language, structure, form, or context, it always needs to come back to meaning. And by meaning, what they're giving you here with that question is a lens through which to interpret that poem. So that poem is clearly about the abuse of power, hence they're asking you a question on it. So that's one possible meaning, interpretation of the poem. Of course, they do like it, higher up the mark scheme, level 5, level 6, if you can offer alternative interpretations, but it should still be linked to abuse of power, but maybe there are more things happening there that you could explore. So whenever I'm talking about language, structure, form, I'm always going to be coming back to meaning by coming back to the question. All right, let's crack on. Okay, so let's have a quick look at things we could say. Let's start with language. Well, we've got this very colloquial, phonetic style, non-standard English, dem tell me, which immediately gives the speaker, which we might think of as Agard, a voice that's very unique and very anti-British, i.e. British establishment, white British establishment. So immediately from the very first line, from the very first word, he's setting himself up in opposition to traditional British education he received in Guyana and the white establishment that has imposed its colonial view of the world on Guyana and on himself. So there we can explore that. Dem is quite interesting as well because it's them and it's kind of they, impersonal, obscure, anonymous. So we might wonder who this generalized mass is. And then we have this kind of, again, you could explore some other words there. And then I think where we can link this more closely to the question is through the idea that he's a victim of the abuse of power with this language. And maybe you can talk about a semantic field if you can find more examples of, kind of a violence or an injury that's the resulting of the violence of the colonial past. Bandaged up my eye, blind me. So there's a violence there and there's an injury which suggests he's a victim of the abuse of power. Interestingly, the start and end of this poem, there's a circular structure which makes this a structural point, which is why I've gone there. But it's the same language being used at the start and the end. So it ends where it starts and there's a kind of continuity there, that this voice resisting the abuse of power, if you wanted to link that closely to the question. Right, now we need to pivot to poem B. Because often we'll be talking about opposition here, we're probably mostly going to be using this one as opposed to this one. And here, in terms of abuse of power, what we're getting is language of domination, of authoritarianism, of dictatorship. And we get that from the frown, the wrinkled lip, the sneer, and the cold command. So we have a kind of semantic field of authoritarianism, i.e. A picture of a visual image of someone, a dictator who has abused their power, and that's the physical manifestation of that. This verb stamped is very interesting because although it's the sculptor stamping, there's a resonance there of people being stamped on, and even the sculptor having to, maybe being tyrannized by Ozymandias here. And then we get the voice of Ozymandias as well. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And obviously, in terms of context, I could immediately pin that to Ramesses II, Egypt. All of this has historical basis. But it's interesting, why is Shelley then reaching back to this historical example of the abuse of power, which ultimately crumbles into this kind of fragmented statue in the desert? Is he offering us some kind of hope to show that even the ugliest, meanest, nastiest dictator can crumble and fall, no matter how apparently powerful they seem at the time? And we can maybe link that to more modern examples of Saddam Hussein, Stalin, these powerful modern dictators who had images of themselves made, who also fell. Okay, let's move on to structure. We've already talked about this very loose, free, structure, and that's form. I'm going to stick with structure here. I think what's interesting here is we get this kind of history lesson. We get 3 mini history lessons here, and this is a kind of re-educates the reader. And I feel that at the very end of the poem, he talks about carving out my identity, and I feel like we've witnessed this through these 3 moments of italicized re-education that we're given, where he's able to reconnect with his true history. So it's a kind of post-colonial revisionism we could talk about here, where instead of the accepted history that the British imposed upon him, he is able to connect closely with his own. There's a sense of pride in that. And again, I think in terms of linking that to the question, it's a way of resisting the abuse of power by reclaiming what is rightfully his. There's a great video on the BBC, Bite Size, of Agard going around a school talking about this. There's a lot of useful AO3 in there. But what we also see in that video is that he's an educator. He does lots of things with his poetry in schools. So he's a very public poet. And this poem itself reflects that kind of poet as educator, as righter of wrongs. And of course, there is some satire in here as well. Don't tell me about 1066 and all that. That's humorous. Tell me about Dick Whittington and he cat. He's constantly kind of mocking the received imposed education. But when he switches to this italicized Guyanan true education or black education of the Caribbean, the tone is more serious, more poetic in the sense of being quite lyric, and I think the tone changes. I think there's a tonal shift between the mockery that we get in these moments here and here and here, compared to here where it becomes more serious and serious. You'll recognise the references to Robin Hood, etc. Pivoting to Ozymandias, what's interesting here is we have a lot of distancing devices. So structurally, this starts with an I, that's all, an anonymous I. Could be the poet, could be anyone. Then we have this traveller, and then we have this kind of embedded speech, and then we get some more speech here, which is supposed to be that of Ozymandias. So we're getting a lot of distancing devices which are framed maybe to protect the radical views of Shelley, who may be using Ramesses II and to talk about the present moment and contemporary politics and his fear of tyranny. There is some really useful stuff, which I'll link to in the description below, about what a radical Shelley was, and how some of his poetry, like The Mask of Anarchy, was published after his death because it was too radical to publish when he was alive, which contained lines like "Rise like lions after slumber in vanquishable number," which suggest kind of revolutionary ideas. We're not long after the French Revolution. Shelley, the Romantic poet, and lots of Romantics were inspired by the French Revolution and upturning, the established norms, which terrified, the British establishment, because they were worried that would happen there. So, there's room to explore why he's using this distancing device, because actually it's quite radical. So there are maybe 3 to 4 voices in this poem, compared to the 2 voices really of the mockery and then these kind of serious mini lectures that we get in Checking Out My History. Finally, let's think about form. Well, obviously, like Agard himself, the form here in Checking Out My History is very loose. There's no punctuation, varied line lengths. We get the use of italics. It's free form, free verse, kind of baggy, loose, and that's willful. That's a kind of a willful resistance to, the straight jacket of British education, British history that's been imposed upon him and his people. In opposition to that, we have Shelley using, a known form, which is a sonnet, although it's neither a true Elizabethan sonnet or a true Petrarchan sonnet. It's a mixture of the two, which also suggests it's doing something kind of radical that links with what we've just said about Shelley as a person and his politics. So it's a new form, but still rigid and less loose than Agard's, but maybe it's a radical like Shelley. And what's interesting here, there are some things that you wouldn't normally find in a sonnet, in a British or in English sonnet, such as the use of ellipses and the fact that the majority of this poem is a chunk of reported speech. And again, you could explore why he's doing that and what that brings to the poem. Right, there we are. I wanted to keep that relatively brief. Likey like, subby sub, and I'll be back with more Felicity anon. Bye for now.